for me, it was always about firstly setting a picture, setting a vision. You're there to inspire, challenge, and test the abilities of individuals, but collectively it grows to be. And these days, in sport, in business, in teams, everybody will talk about psychological safety, so that really, Neil, your opinion is as much as important as the coach's opinion, and we need to be able to express those things. We need to be able to challenge people. And I've always had the view that the player needs to be their own best coach. So by that I mean, going back to those 4 skill sets, I wanted players to have a very strong sense of what it was that they needed to prepare themselves well to get ready to go and play on their stage. That's what Warner and McGrath, who were incredible bowlers in their own right. But it wasn't just them. There was 9, 10 other people around them all the time that were either batting or bowling to put ourselves in a position to win games, because we always believed we could, no matter what the situation was. But unless the captain and the coach are in sync, then, as I say, that just doesn't take long for it to filter into the dressing room. Is it when they were performing well, what is it that they were doing to give themselves the opportunity to perform well? That's the starting point always.
Cricket Love Stories with Mini Okagram. Today, again, we're joined by John Buchanan. John, how's things going in Australia?
Hi, Neil. Well, in our part of the world, which is, I'm in Brisbane and in Queensland, things are pretty good.
So, John, you're one of the most successful cricket coaches in the history of the game, especially with the Australian national side. You're going to give us some cricket coaching tips and advice for all. So let's start off with a very high-level question. What, in your opinion, is the role of a head coach in a cricket team?
Well, again, for me, it was always about firstly setting a picture, setting a vision. You're there to inspire, challenge, and test the abilities of individuals, but collectively a group. And to do that, I guess you have to have some assessment about the skill levels, and therefore you have to be a bit realistic sometimes about your vision. So it's not much sense saying to a team, well, we are going to go through the season undefeated when last season you ran stone motherless last in the competition. And you haven't necessarily imported any or had any new talent come into your team. So you need to be realistic in terms of the vision, but it also needs to be very much a stretch. So for me, that's always step number 1. Step number 2 then is given the vision and given where you either start the season or start the pre-season or start your preparation for the coming season, there's an assessment of, well, where we're at, and therefore if we're here now and that's the picture where we want to go, what are the key things that we need to then go about doing so that it gives us a chance of getting there? Those things obviously reside within your control. So from a technical sense, the batsmen, the bowlers, the fieldsmen, the wicket keepers and so on, what are some of the key skills that we need to actually now improve as individuals so that when we go out to perform on the field, we can produce better and more consistent performances. So that really an important step, I guess, those key strategies around, those skills that we want. And then beyond your technical skills, some physical skills will come into play, so it may be that bowlers, have a very good first spell, but they find it difficult coming back for a second or a third spell, depending on the type of game or the type of format you're playing. So physically, maybe that's something that all our bowling group could work on so that they can physically at least cope with the demands of what's expected of them in game. Then obviously there's the execution of that, which comes back to your technical skills. Mental skills, again, is a pretty critical one, and that is, again, when either I go out to bat or I go to field or I'm in the, ready in the field. How do I switch on and switch off? How do I actually get into that moment so that I'm ready to either face the ball, deliver the ball, or field the ball? And, that's a pretty important skill, because if I can clear all the static around me, all the things that are going to distract my mind, then it gives me that ability, if I'm a batsman, just to see the ball, not to think about how fast the ball is coming at me, what the bowler looks like, possibly feels when having said something to me just before the bowl's about to bowl, or, I've got a heap of slips behind me, all those sort of things. They're set aside and you just deal with the ball. And then there are the tactical skills. The tactical skills really, where you can, it depends again on the level that you're playing, but a head coach really needs to employ all the knowledge and experience that resides in the dressing room. But beyond that, what other sort of information can I bring to bear on the game that I'm about to play, or the opposition that we've got coming up, or this stage of the game? So, data always becomes pretty important. What sort of data is that? How do I use the data? How do I interpret it? How do I go about explaining it so that it doesn't make things too complicated, but it gives us some sort of advantage when we go on the field? So there are some of the things that I think really is important to the role of the head coach. Set the picture, know where you're at, then have the strategies to get there, and they generally, as I say, fall in that technical, physical, mental, tactical skill sets.
Regardless of the talent of a given team, does a high-performance environment rely on the players actually buying into the coaching philosophy?
Yeah, pretty much so. I think right at the moment, you can look at maybe the England team and how they performed just recently against India. We can look at the Australian cricket team at the moment and how it's, again, not performing in the T20 environment. And yet both teams and both squads you would regard as playing elite sport, and therefore that they would like to be performing at their best every time they go out on the field. But there's something not clicking in there for whatever reason. And one of the key reasons generally is that the vision, or the way that we're going about actually trying to chase that vision, isn't resonating with a group of people, or some people within that environment. And because that's not resonating with some people in that environment, then it sends that ripple effect out. Like I can give my own personal examples of that. I coached in Middlesex for a year. I coached in the IPL for the first two tournaments, and I think vision was good with Middlesex when that was 98. When I went there, we created a vision. It wasn't just me saying this is what I think Middlesex can achieve. We did that on a pre-season camp with all the players, apart from three guys that were in England at the time, which was Phil Tufnell, Gus Fraser, and Mark Ramprakash. And so we created that vision, the way that we're going to go about it. And then when the English tourists came back, we brought them into the fold, talked them through how that would operate. And that all seemed okay till, I guess I ran headlong into Mark Ramprakash at that point, because he had just been appointed captain. He was hell-bent on trying to retain his position within the England team. And he felt that what we were doing and what we were going about to do was going to interfere with the way that he needed to prepare and what he needed to do, in a sense, to retain his position within the England team. So what happened there, over time, it just created tensions between he and myself, and that reverberated right through the dressing room. And those tensions just then found effect on the field, because our performances, probably after about 8 weeks or so, really declined, because it was just a very uncomfortable place to be. And these days, in sport, in business, in teams, everybody will talk about psychological safety, so that really, Neil, your opinion is as much as important as the coach's opinion, and we need to be able to express those things. We need to be able to challenge people. And to do that, that again is one of the key roles of the head coach. If I go back to those environments that you set up, the head coach must encourage that environment to occur, because that way then you can get that sort of feeling that as a young person or as a young player, I can actually make a comment, or it will be heard, or, you know, I can make an error here and I won't be, you know, shunned by the rest of the group. So when you don't have that environment and you have a culture that tends to lead itself to fragmentation, fractures, cliques, and all that sort of unhelpful dynamics within a dressing room, that's when I think you get the overall performances that certainly kind of seeing in Australia with its T20 performances, and possibly we're seeing with England against India at the moment. I'm not suggesting that what I've just said about my experiences in Middlesex is exactly what's happening in those dressing rooms, but a high performance environment is one where those potential fractures, issues, and so on are there, but they find a way to be actually surfaced by the group, discussed by the group, agreed by the group, and then move on.
And off the field in practice, what is the balance between the coach dictating what needs to be done on a given day and the players having input on what they feel is required for improvement?
Yeah, look, it's a good one. I mean, I've always had the view that the player needs to be their own best coach. You know, so by that I mean, going back to those 4 skill sets, I wanted players to have a very strong sense of what it was that they needed to prepare themselves well to get ready to go and play on their stage. You know, because that's what was important. We wanted our players to be at their best. There's no guarantee you're necessarily going to perform, but you needed to give yourself the best chance of doing that. So it was always important that the individuals had that opportunity to prepare themselves the best way they possibly could. But of course, you reside then within this group context, and your resources are always limited. Doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a national team or whether you're just a club team. Your resources are always going to be limited, albeit that one's got a heck of a lot more than the other. But again, going back to what we were just saying before about relativities, it all becomes relative. And so resources such as time, such as, you know, wickets, such as bowlers, such as game scenarios, such as access to physio or whatever it might be, they all have a finite amount, particularly if you've got a group of players. So while it's all very well to say, well, you know, we're going to look after you, player A, and we're going to look after you, player B, and we're going to look after you, player C, if that's all you did, then players D to Z miss out. So there needs to be an accommodation of both individual need and collective need, and really it's the coach's job to manage that compromise, if you like, between just being totally focused on an individual and at the same stage trying to bring a whole group together at the same point to get ready for a game.
And when it comes to selection, what is your philosophies on that? Should it be based on the best playing 11 regardless of conditions, or is there a horses for courses element which needs to be factored in every game?
Look, I think it's a bit of that. I think what's certainly in international cricket these days is obviously we've got a third format, which is T20 cricket, and then we've almost got a fourth format, which is, say, the IPL. You know, so the IPL has got its own window, and there are a number of players who end up playing over there. We've just seen quite recently with the Australian team that a number of our senior players, in a sense, refused to go to the West Indies because they were talking about suffering from fatigue bubble, which may or may not be the case, but that fatigue bubble was brought on by the fact that they made a decision to go to the IPL, which is outside the parameters of you know, the Australian team schedule. You know, so in terms of selections, though, I think you're always aiming to try to put your best team on the field every time. Now, that may mean your best team will have some changes in it because of the conditions of the game or where you're playing, or it may have something to do with the format of the game. So from my point of view these days, it was a little bit different when I was coaching, but if I was coaching these days, I would tend to be saying, well, we're playing with a squad of players. So your squad might be anywhere between, 15 and 18, for instance. And so given that squad of players, yes, we're always trying to put our best players on the field, but there is an acknowledgement that in these conditions, we may not need our fast bowler, but we may need an extra spinner. Or it may say, look, our fast bowler has played or has had a reasonably heavy workload. We may take the option to rest that player and bring in another quick bowler or an all-rounder in this situation because, one, we might lose a little bit in terms of bowling capability, but overall we may gain in the longer run by resting a quick bowler and playing this player now because it'll give that person a bit more experience and we can rest a quicker bowler because we've got this other game or this other series coming up where we need that person. So again, I think it's always an interesting balance, but I think these days you would tend to decide I've got a 15 to 18, maybe a little bit bigger squad of players, and we play with a squad. And I think that's really what England's been doing quite successfully for its one-day format. And I think India's been doing it pretty successfully for a period of time now. They're really building out a depth of players so that they can kind of interchange where they need to, and again, depending on format, depending on conditions.
Winning becomes a habit, as seen with your great Australian side. How can a ruthless winning mentality be installed in a cricket team?
It's got to be owned by everybody. It's no good it just being owned by the coach or the captain or a couple of senior players. It has to be owned by everybody. And I think, again, if we just sit on that recent example of, say, this test match between India and England where, it was a pretty evenly balanced test match. I didn't get to see all of it, but I was watching the scoreboard a little bit. And coming into that final day, both teams had a chance to win. But it was interesting just listening to the commentators and then beginning to watch Root and the players and maybe the field settings that he was using for his bowlers and the type of attack they were using. When they picked up a couple of wickets, they maintained their attack. They maintained that sort of, if you want to call it ruthlessness, or this belief that they, can knock over India and then secure the win. But as Bumrah and Ishan continued to develop a partnership, they went very quickly into a defensive mode, meaning that taking away, catching positions, really trying to bowl short and intimidate the batsman, and it wasn't working. And so there was this sense, definitely from the commentators, and definitely you could see it on the field, that, wow, we could be in a position here where there's going to be too many runs for us to chase. So there was a lack of belief in that room, it seemed, that, any sort of target over 180, 200 was going to be way beyond us. In the good high-performance teams, if you like, and this is where I think India exemplified it, their tail end batting was able to get through whatever they had to get through and then posted a score, and then they were on a roll. There was nothing that was really going to stop them, it seemed. And Kohli leads that way, and he inspires his players that way, I think, to go about, their cricket in that sort of manner. But that's a sign, I think, of a side that can demonstrate that. It's not just owned by him because, again, from a batting perspective, he didn't dominate the game one little bit. But other people around him took on their roles and did them exceptionally well. And that's why I say it has to be owned by everybody, because if it's only owned by one or two, that capacity to be able to impose yourself on a game like that is very, very difficult. And then, say with us, with our teams, obviously we have Warner McGrath, who are incredible bowlers in their own right. But it wasn't just them. There was 9, 10 other people around them all the time that were either batting or bowling to put ourselves in a position to win games, because we always believed we could, no matter what the situation was.
Describe the role of a cricket captain, the relationship with the head coach to ensure that philosophy is carried out.
Yeah, you have to be in sync. You know, I just mentioned that example before with myself and Mark Ramprakash at the time. You know, we just didn't see eye to eye on really how we should be going about playing our cricket. And there are various reasons for all that. We don't need to go back into history. And you know, certainly we've both moved on, and Mark's developed himself into a very, very good coach, and probably understands the coaching role a lot more than what he did at that time. But unless the captain and the coach are in sync, then, as I say, that just doesn't take long for it to filter into the dressing room. And it's the same in business. You know, it's you know, whether it's the board chairman and the CEO, or you know, CEO and his leadership team, if they're not in sync, it's very difficult then to produce really high or good results, but be able to sustain those results, which is really the essence of high performance.
Then a question I wanted to ask you in terms of the staff you have around the head coach. Say, for example, a player, take a batsman, for example, has worked with a different coach through their junior years. Would you be happy for that player to continue to work with that coach alongside, for example, the batting coach that you've appointed for your specific team?
Always. You know, I think, as I said, what becomes really important, firstly, is that the individual player knows their own game, their own best coach. And if part of that is that a coach knows how to get the best from them, then they should be as close to them as possible. Now, logistics doesn't always allow that. But these days that's changed a little bit, obviously, with technology. I think, you can bring them into the rooms at any time you want. But, one of my examples was always Shane Warne. There was, me trying to talk to Shane Warne about leg spin is about the same as me understanding how you get a rocket and fly to the moon. But what was really important was when he was in doubt or a bit anxious about his own game, we called Terry Jenner, who was his own personal coach. Now, where that was possible, Terry Jenner would come into our training sessions. And, and again, as Terry would say, not that he was necessarily telling him too much, it's just that was a really, really strong relationship, and that kind of settled Shane at certain times for certain series or certain games. So I'd always, where possible, be encouraging other coaches in, because the other upside of it, about all that, is that those coaches then begin to see the environment as well. They get to learn a little bit about you, and you get to learn a little bit about them. They get to learn a little bit more about this sort of high performance environment, which then they can take back into their own coaching situations too.
How do you deal with a player that has lost confidence and is out of form?
Look, again, that's always difficult. However, that's why I say it becomes really important to be your own best coach. So, in other words, to be your own best coach is, those 4 skill sets: technical, physical, mental, tactical. They become your basics. That's your basic game plan. And so when you're not getting the results that you would like, then you need reference points. And while you might be able to engage a coach or coaches to help you, unless you really clearly understand what your basic reference points are, and this can be in-game as well as outside of game, then it becomes a struggle. And that's why some players, no matter how good they are, do go into these, in inverted commas, slumps, and they're in a bit of a quandary for a period of time, mainly because they've never really identified their own basics properly. And so that becomes, always the starting point for me to go back to basics so that the player understands what those basics are, whether it's bowlers, batters, fielders, whatever it might be. What is it when they were performing well? What is it that they were doing to give themselves the opportunity to perform well? That's the starting point always.
Again, what is the head coach's role when you drop a player from a communication perspective to ensure that the player has clarity and does have the opportunity to then correct their game and come back potentially?
Yeah, look, that again is always a difficult one. I mean, very rarely are you going to get complaints from people who get selected, that they're going to put a hand up and say, hey, gee, I'm selected, but I don't think I should be, and what can I do about it? Most people who are selected don't have too much to say, but it's the ones that sit on the edge, the ones that miss out. They're the ones that are desperately trying to find information that will allow them to come back into the side, or at least allow them to understand why they're not in the side. And so that communication has to be very clear. I think you mentioned before that there are sometimes a lot of support staff around players. Well, there's also the selection panels that sit around players as well. And of course, players are no different to young children. They are trying to find out, why they're not in the team, or a young child is trying to find out why I can't go and watch TV at the moment. So they go to mum, and mum says, well, these are the reasons. So the young child says, well, I don't like those reasons, so then they go to dad, and dad, will give them some other reasons. And so suddenly you've got mum and dad being played off against each other by the child, and eventually mum and dad decide, oh, you can go and watch TV, and so that's what can happen within selection process, that if there are too many people involved, players will gradually find a whole range of different, sometimes conflicting versions of why they're not in the side, and then they replay that back to the group or back to those people. And so it becomes very difficult then for a coach or a selector or a captain to clearly relate what it is that you need to do. So I think, it's firstly important that I think the head coach takes the role. The selectors, obviously in cricket these days, pretty traditional. They're the ones that tell the players. If they tell the players, then they've got to tell the players specifically what it is that is missing, what it is that they're looking for. And of course, sometimes it's very difficult to do that because it's not necessarily results that they're out of the team, but there's something to do with a bit of a fit or cultural fit, within the group, or there's something to do with this notion of resting that might be a little bit hard to understand by the person who's missing the selection. So, but nonetheless, firstly, try to reduce the number of people that are communicating the decision. And secondly, what is communicated needs to be very specific about what is required for that person to present back to the selection panel about why now I should be re-included, why I'm knocking on the door again.
And at the grassroots level, do you think sometimes young players are overcoached? What are your views about the technical coaching for a kid? So is it a good thing that should take place, or do you think that the raw talent of a player should be encouraged and only minor tweaks done as they go through the levels? What are your views and general philosophies on that subject?
Yeah, look, there's a few things. Again, the young cricketer with a coach need to kind of understand, well, if I advance my career, so I'm a 14-year-old boy or girl and have great aspirations of playing for my country. So, that's probably not likely to occur for another 10 years. So in 10 years, where's the game going to be? What will the game look like at that point in time? So again, there's a bit of a picture, it's a bit of crystal balling, but it probably means, that you're going to need cricket's advancing in terms of its athleticism. There's no doubt about that. And so along with athleticism, the game is being shortened. That's becoming a pretty prominent feature. in terms of the amount of cricket being played. So that becomes a bit of a power game. That's power hitting, that's, short, express bowling, if you like, for 4 overs, or it's dynamic activity in the field for 20 overs where you can, save runs and exert pressure on the batting side by your fielding capabilities. So, you're kind of trying to say, well, this may be where things are going. So what we need to be doing now is developing a really, really strong foundation base so that you can, develop those sorts of skills into the future. Now, I've always been an advocate of right and left-handedness, and I still believe that young people who are given the opportunity to nurture that skill, there will be some out there who will be able to do that, when they're 24. Very few will, but some will. Now, most people will say, well, the game's too complicated, you make it more complicated. Well, for those who can do that, it's not complicated. It will just come natural to them, and they will play and train and do all those sorts of things. But they need to be encouraged by the system and by coaches around it. The other thing I think that really is important is reducing specialisation. So again, on this basis of trying to broaden your skill base and test your skills, that the longer I think that young people, that 14-year-old, can remain active in other sports, rather than just being a cricket player and just being a right-hand cricket player or a left-hand cricket player, and being termed a batsman or a bowler. The longer that we can avoid that specialisation, the better in cricket. There are obviously some sports, say rugby, for instance, and if you're going to play in rugby front row, you're going to need to develop that sort of size and capacity to handle those stresses from an early stage, and so you tend to be specialised. Or if you're a gymnast, again, it's around size. You don't necessarily want very tall or very heavy athletes, because you just can't do the sort of things that sport's going to require of it and has required of it over a period of time in developing it. So, but cricket generally can cater for most sizes and most skill sets. So if we can broaden that base all the time, give young people that opportunity to deliver different technical skill sets. But of course, the more that you interact in other sports, you're interacting with different people, different social settings. And so I think that's a very, very balanced approach as well. So we're seeking, I think, always that balance, increasing the skill-based foundation, and gradually, maybe by the time 17, 18, 19 comes around, then specialisation might become a little bit more evident to them. But of course, what happens is coaches, associations, pathway development want to grab them very quickly and get them into that sort of high performance or that elite pathway. And so it actually, I think, works against developing their player in the best way possible, or give them the best foundations possible.
Well, it's a fascinating subject. We could talk all day about it, but just to end on, what is your best piece of advice for a young and up-and-coming coach?
Yeah, very, very difficult one. That I think. Firstly, I think coaching is just a fantastic career path. It is that because it's a bit like parenting. You have the opportunity to work with young people, and young people can be 35-year-olds that I was working with, and you have the ability to influence the way that they develop as not only sports people, but as people, that sort of whole person. So I think that is in itself just an incredible opportunity. But to do so, I guess, that means trying to make sure that your horizons are as broad as they possibly can be. So I wouldn't necessarily, as a coach, be looking for, huge, important roles when I'm really young. I think what becomes important is that you start your coaching career like an athlete. Try to start with young people, trying to coach young people, try to understand how they operate, how do you engage them, how do you keep developing their skills, and gradually take your steps along the way. If you're wanting to pursue a coaching career that has an endpoint as, a national coach, you might choose that you wanted to be one of the best coaches, but all you want to do is stay within the junior ranks, because you understand that, that's the most important place that we can have our best coaches, is it with young people, to give them those foundations. So I think, understand maybe what it is that you're wanting to do in coaching, where you want to be. Take your time on the way, broaden your horizons, and eventually it's all about you being the support act to developing the person, rather than the lead act.
John, perfect. Thank you very much for your time once again, and all the best for the months ahead. Thank you.
Pleasure, Neil. Good talking.
So Neil Kagram, Cricket Last Stories, John Buchanan. Thank you.